Hi, so this is going to be the first Unity tutorial that I've done. So I'm a lecturer at Swansea University, and this year, or next year, I'll be starting a games programming course. And as part of that, I'm going to be making some videos. And since I get paid by the taxpayer, then I'm going to share these on YouTube. If you're interested in doing the course, it's something we teach in the third year at Swansea Uni, so you can sign up. Obviously there are loads of Unity tutorials out there, and there's lots of really good ones. What I'm going to be focusing on is, I'm going to do it as if you haven't done Unity before, but I'm going to expect, you need to have some programming background. The course that I'm doing is more about programming patterns and how to structure your code when you're making games. And I'm trying to do that in the context of Unity. So for a lot of people, you might be coming to this and it's the first time you've seen it. So I will be introducing some basics, but I'm going to be talking a lot about programming patterns and programming concepts in relation to games. And today, this first video is going to be all about components, why we use components and how they're used in Unity. So I've opened up a new Unity project here. And the thing that I'm going to do today is I'm going to imagine a situation where we have a sprite and we want that sprite on screen, and we want it to have a random sprite from a series of sprites we've already got. And this is actually something that I literally implemented this yesterday for a game that I'm working on. So we have here 3 sprites. They're 3 different variations, and in the game we want every time one of these is created it to be a random different one. So the first thing I'm going to do is to import this into Unity. So that's pretty easy. So in my folder, my project view, I'm going to create a folder. I'm going to call it Sprites. And that's where I'm going to put these sprites. I'm just going to drag them in there. So when I set up this Unity project, I set it up to be 2D. So it's already kind of got, that just means that a lot of the default way the editor is working is ready for you to use 2D stuff. So the way that the scene view is in 2D rather than 3D, and the camera is orthographic, which means that it's a 2D camera. So I've imported these sprites. First thing I want to do is change the import settings slightly. So I happen to know that these are 24 pixels per unit, what they're designed for. It's pixel art, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this filter mode and turn that to point no filter, otherwise our pixel art will get kind of blurred a little bit. And then I'm also going to look at this compression here. I'm going to turn off compression because, again, if you have, we don't need to compress these textures, they're tiny anyway. And with pixel art, that compression will create artifacts and it'll make it look weird. Something to remember is, as well, if you use sprite atlases, you'll need to remember to set those settings on there as well. So we've got our sprites in there. So let's talk about, so we need an entity for these sprites to go on. And the entity in Unity, entities are called game objects. And so I'm going to create an empty game object in my scene. So I've got this hierarchy here, and I right-clicked and clicked create empty. And that has created a game object. And a game object is a collection of components. Now, the reason that we use components is that when we have an entity like, let's say, a player, a character, that player character is going to have lots of things related to it. It's going to have a position, it's going to have some kind of rendering component, it's going to have some kind of physics, some kind of player input control. If we tried to put all of that into one class, that would be a massive class, and we'd have all sorts of things interacting with each other, which would make that really hard to maintain. Whereas what we do is we have components. So this game object, which is the equivalent of is the entity that we have in Unity, it currently has one component on it by default, which is a transform. And the transform is the position. It's basically information. So there's a bit, it's got all the information about the position of this entity in space. And we can see that here in the editor, that this transform component has got a position, a rotation, and a scale. And that's what it's got at the moment. Now, if we want this, so we want this to be our sprite. So we want this to render a sprite. So we need to add a component. So I'm going to click Add Component. And I'm going to click and type Sprite Renderer. So it's here, Sprite Renderer. Click on that, and now we've given it a Sprite Render component. And at the moment, we can't see anything. But if I drag one of these sprites into here, then we can see our sprite is being rendered. So this Sprite Renderer contains all of the information, all the logic to do with our actual rendering. So it's got the sprite itself, which is like the image. It's got a color, so we can actually change the tint of this sprite if we want to. We can change the opacity there. And we've got some stuff we can change with like the draw mode and other things here. So, okay, let's reset. If I click on this transform, I can reset it to the center. And we can see that there. And we've got everything set to simple. We can also set material for the actual sprite, which changes, it's how the shader works, how it gets rendered, but we don't need to worry about that for now. So everything to do with the sprite is contained in this Sprite Renderer component. And so the Sprite Renderer component doesn't need to know anything about the location. The transform, we can adjust the position of the transform here, and the Sprite Renderer, or the sprite is being rendered in the correct position based on this transform. I'm not having to mess with the actual renderer itself, which is good. Now, let's say we want to add, so we wanted to make it so that this sprite had a random one of these three sprites every time it gets, what we say, instantiated when it gets created. To do that, we're going to need to add our own behavior. And so we're going to make our own component to do that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder, which is going to be scripts. And eventually when you get to a big project, you're going to want even more subfolders here. But for now, I'm going to create a C# script. And I'm going to call this random sprite behavior. And then I'm going to open this up. And it'll open up in Visual Studio. Once it's opened up, I will make this so it's at a window size. Now, when we make components in Unity, we tend to, in the vast majority of cases, in all cases, we inherit from this base class called monobehavior. You can see Unity has already done that for us automatically. And it's included a couple of methods from that base class, start method and the update method. And it tells you exactly what these do. So the start method is called before the first frame, and the update is called once per frame. Now we've created this class, random sprite behavior. We can straight away go to our game object. I'm going to name this actually. I'm going to call this cargo sprite. Or cargo object. Doesn't make sense to call it sprite because it isn't a sprite, right? It has a sprite on it, but it's an object. And I can just drag this onto the cargo object, and this has that behavior, but it doesn't do anything at the moment. So let's code some behavior. Now our class is going to need some information. So let's have a think what it's going to need. First thing it's going to need to know what sprites to pick from, which of the sprites, it's the collection of sprites that are possible. And so we're going to create a private sprite. So sprite is just the type in Unity that is the sprites. And we're going to call this sprites, and we're going to make this an array. Now, if we look in Unity now, it'll compile that. You can see nothing's changed because I set this to be private. If I set it to be public, and I can come back here, and now I can actually add the sprites to this component in the editor. But that's the way most people do it. And it's the most obvious way, and it's the way I used to do it, but it's not necessarily the correct way. By making this public, what I'm doing is I'm meaning that anywhere in the code, I can grab this random sprite behavior and change the value of sprites. And I'm not so sure that's what I want people to be able to do, because the idea behind what I'm doing is that when the game starts, it picks a random sprite from those set of sprites that I've set in the editor. If I make this a public variable, I'll be able to change that somewhere else in the code. Maybe someone else coming in might think that's how you meant to use it, but actually it's not. So what we can do is we can make this private, and we can tell Unity to serialize this field. So I'm going to say serialize field sprites. And then we go back to the editor, and we can still see that we've got our sprites there, our list. So we can then very easily just, what I usually do is I click on this cargo object. I'm going to lock it in the inspector so it won't, when I click on something else, it's not going to change. Left click, hold shift, left click to select all these sprites, and then I can just drag them into that sprites array there. And I've got my 3 sprites here. But at the moment, it's still not doing anything. If I click play and run the game, it's just going to show me that one sprite. Nothing's changed, or nothing's happening. What we need to do is we need to get this random sprite behavior component to talk to the sprite renderer. And the way that we do that, there's several ways to do it. Lots and lots of different ways to do it. And like, I don't know if there's a best way or what, but the way that most people start is the way I'm about to show you. Is that we can, because we're inheriting this monobehavior class, we can get a reference to the actual game object container that contains all of the components. So what I can do, and that just happens to be game object. And if you look, the Unity or Visual Studio is doing an autocomplete. And that game object is where we can get other components. And I'm putting this in the start method because I want the random sprite to be selected before the game starts. So I want that's in the first frame. There is actually there's an awake method, which is even earlier, but in this case, I'm going to do it in the start. So a new game object, and then I can get component. And get component is what will get other components in this game object. And it's a generic or a templating class. So I'm going to say get component of type Sprite Renderer. Okay. And then this will go into game object and it will get the Sprite Renderer. If that Sprite Renderer doesn't exist, this will be null. So you need to be aware of that. Is that, and I'll show how we can do that in a moment. So Sprite Renderer, I happen to know if I want to set the sprite, there's just a variable there, sprite. I can just set that and that will change the sprite in that Sprite Renderer. And I want to set it to a random value of sprites. So a random element from sprites. I want sprites. And then in that array, I'm going to get random range. And I happen to know that in Unity, to get a random element from array, I just pick random range between 0 and the length of the array. And that works because the random range, oh, I should be using range, sorry. Range, if you look, if I get the documentation up. So random range returns a random integer between the minimum inclusive, so the minimum value we put in there is possible, and the max exclusive, so the maximum value isn't possible. So it goes between min and max minus 1. So that's 0 and sprites.length. And that's going to give us a random number between 0 and 1 minus the length of the sprites. So I'll save that. Come back in here. Just to convince you that this is working, I'm going to delete the sprite there, so we don't need to give that a sprite there. I'm going to click play, and there you go. I've got a sprite. I'm going to unmaximize this. You can see that's panel 1 that time. Let's turn it off and on again. And there we go. We've got a different one. So we've got a random sprite each time. Now, I want to show you something though. What happens if I get rid of this component? So let's imagine that I'm going to remove that component. I'm going to remove this component. Imagine you're like, you've just implemented this script, random sprite behavior. Now I come along and I'm like, okay, I want to have a random sprite on my object. So what I might do is I might just drag this in, random sprite behavior. I'm going to put my sprites in. Lock this again. I'm just going to chuck all my sprites in. That'll work, right? Click play. And then I've got an error. Which says, missing component, there is no sprite renderer attached to the cargo game object. So what I did is when I implemented this, one of the key things about components is that you try and remove coupling between things. But sometimes we need to communicate between components, and components will assume. So this sprite behavior is assuming that this game object has a sprite renderer. And at the moment, the way we've got this implemented, it's possible for us to add this sprite behavior to an object that doesn't have a sprite renderer. And what we can actually do is Unity gives us a really good tool for ensuring this. So I can do type of sprite. If I do require component type of sprite renderer, what that tells Unity is it says, right, this random sprite behavior must have a sprite renderer. And so now let's go back to do the same thing as we did before. I'm going to remove this component. And now in my scripts, I'm going to add that random sprite behavior, and you can see that it automatically added our sprite renderer for us. So therefore, that'll work. When we go to do it, we know we've got that sprite renderer. One thing to bear in mind is when you do this, if you add this, this doesn't work in retrospect. So if you put this in as a fix, it won't automatically go back and add that component to your objects. So just bear that in mind. So this is kind of a basic way that we can communicate, write components and then communicate between components on a game object. And really, one of the really big advantages of this is that having coded this random sprite behavior, this you can just drag on any single object and it will work. You don't need to know anything about the objects, the thing that you're doing. You could use this on your player character. You could use this on a decoration that has nothing to do with gameplay. Like you could use this random sprite behavior to make random trees appear. And those trees could do nothing but have just that they're there and all they need is a transformer and a renderer. They just exist to look pretty. Or we could even add some physics. So we could have something that's got a rigid body. And this random sprite behavior doesn't care about any of the rest of it. All it cares about is that there's a sprite renderer and it will work. And it makes your code really reusable. And what you kind of want to think about is when you're coding stuff is when you start having a class that's really, really big, you need to think, right, can I split this into multiple components? Because not only is it going to make your code easier to debug, because you've got like this class does one thing, and there's basically one line of code in it, right? If there's a problem with this randomization, we can come straight here and see where the problem is. Like the smaller classes you have, the better, and you can easily reuse it. So yeah, hopefully I'll be posting these kind of semi-short tutorials which go along with the course that I'm running at Swansea University over the coming months. Thanks for watching.